late adolescence, we find something really big happens in terms of their self-concept and their personal narrative. They started off in elementary school as a really basic, concrete personal narrative. They started to add some more evaluative and abstract stuff in early adolescence. When we get to mid to late adolescence, around age 15, age 16, all of a sudden, we experience what's known as Erik Erikson's identity versus confusion conflict. And this is a major point in adolescence where we have to figure out who we are. But we also have the cognitive ability to hold lots of ideas and exceptions in our head, so we don't truly know who we are. And so it's very common at this age where people start to experiment and try and figure who they are, or they just get really confused by who they are. Now, before I knew this theory was real, when I was 16 and I was in grade 10, I was asked by my former teacher to write a paragraph about who I was. And it was the first time in my life I wasn't sure who I was, because everything I thought I was before adolescence seemed to be questionable at this point in my development. And so I wrote it down, and I still had this, and when I learned about this later on, I said, oh, this makes sense. So here's what I legitimately wrote. Who am I? I'm really a mixture of things. Some people say I'm really shy, but others say I'm really hyper and loud. Some people say I'm nice and kind, but others say I'm mean and selfish. Some people say I'm smart and clever, but others say I make stupid mistakes. Every day I feel like a lot of things, and I really do not know who I am. So it's just a component of the piece I wrote. And so this really reflects back to the idea that we understand that in different contexts, we might start to play different roles. And based on how comfortable you are around other people or how nervous you are, different parts of your personality may jump out. And so this is something that's very typical to struggle with. And Canadian-born social psychologist John Marcia actually had a theory about how adolescents and young adults go through this and try and navigate who they are. He actually found that there's a series of domains that we're constantly trying to find our identity with. And so this is the idea, trying to figure out what is in our self-concept, trying to figure out who we are is a struggle. And it often takes a lot of introspection and a lot of self-respection from the age of 15 to who knows when in our lifespan to figure out all these different components. And although there could be infinite number of components, these are the components he listed tended to be the most common for adolescents and young adults to start to question. So they started to question things like their career identity. What do they want to do for an occupation? Do they want to work? Where do they want to go? So if they want to go to university, what's their major? What is the job they plan to have someday? That we put a lot of time in emphasizing that. What is their political identity? This might be, are they more conservative? Are they more liberal? Are they more of a socialist? Are they more of an anarchist? Where do they fit on the political spectrum? What's their religious identity? Are they a person of faith or are they an atheist? Are they going to change which faith they belong to or change how they devote themselves to their faith? What's their relationship identity? Do they want to get married? Do they want to stay unmarried? What do they think about relationships? Do they believe in marriage? Do they think everyone gets divorced? Are they polyamorous? Are they monogamous? With that as well, their sexual identity. Do they believe they're straight or is there something more to it? Perhaps they're pansexual, bisexual, gay, or lesbian? What about their intellectual identity? Do they feel they're smart or do they wonder if they're not smart enough? What about their cultural/ethnic identity? Do they embrace their heritage or do they pursue other things? Do they assimilate to the people around them or do they go back into their roots and tap into their roots of their culture? What about their physical identity? Do they think they're strong? Do they think they're weak? Do they accept that they have a disability? What about their personality traits? Do they think they're outgoing or withdrawn or careful or reckless? And finally, what are their hobbies? What do they think of the hobbies that really speak to them? So these things can change. Important to understand, Marcia did not say that how we develop these identities had to go in a linear fashion. So Marcia believed there was 4 mechanisms. You can see them listed in the 4 bubbles. We have diffusion, foreclosure, moratorium, and achievement. And it's possible for someone to go through in the order I just listed. But it's also possible for someone to bounce around as if they're playing pinball and the pinball is just kind of jumping around on the board. It's possible for us to constantly go back and forth. So the one that we start off with, the only order in these different domains is diffusion. We always start off with identity diffusion. And diffusion is a lack of identity or identity deficit crisis. This is the idea that you don't know. And this is the idea that when you're a kid, you may not have a political identity or a sexuality identity because you've never considered it. It's not something that you've contemplated before. And so diffusion is the mechanism where you don't really have a plan. You don't know who you are. You don't know what job you want. You don't know what your hobbies are. You don't know if you're good at sports. That sort of nature. You don't know what religion you believe in. You've never considered it before. So diffusion is a lack of consideration or a lack of identity. And we all tend to start there. Then one of the possibilities we may go to after diffusion, but we may not, this is an optional mechanism, is foreclosure. Foreclosure is the idea that you are going to pick the identity that someone else suggested for you. This might be that you inherit the family business, or you take the major on that your parents suggested, or you go to the college your friends want, or you accept the political views that the people around you have accepted, or you just go along with the religion you were raised in. But foreclosure is the idea that you're accepting a ready-made identity by default, and you never really considered it. You're not doing it because you're sure you like it. You're just doing it because it's the one that was there. And so you're not really experimenting with alternatives. This may not necessarily be bad. It's just the idea that you've never really thought about it. Some people who follow foreclosure, they then realize decades later that that's not what they wanted. But for some people, it is a good fit. Now, another optional domain that most of us do experience is called moratorium. Rather than no identity, or rather than just taking the first identity offered to you, moratorium is this active period of questioning. You're actively going to try and experiment. So this is the idea that you're open-minded. You see options in your identity as a buffet, and you're going to question, and you're going to try on lots of different hats or lots of different shoes, or try lots of different hobbies. Maybe you want to be a musician or a botanist or an astrophysicist, or maybe you want to go into pottery or math. And it's the idea that you will try out different majors. You will try out different political platforms. You'll read about different parties. You'll try out different religions and visit different areas of worship. You'll read about sexual minority groups and contemplate and introspect on your own sexuality. This is the idea that you are open to exploring yourself deeply. Now, this can be a stressful time. Although this is adaptive, it can be hard on one to understand and say, oh, I wonder what I think. I wonder what I believe. And so this is something that doesn't have to be a one and done phase. You can stay in moratorium for decades and be actively questioning things. But sometimes after moratorium, we tend to land in the fourth domain, which is known as achievement. Achievement is the idea that you found satisfaction after moratorium. You found a path that makes sense to you. And when you're on this path, you feel right. You feel a sense of fulfillment, and you feel a sense of self-actualization. This feels like it's your true calling. And so this is the idea that things are making sense for you now. You feel like you've picked the right job, or you have the right faith, or you are self-actualized with your sexuality, and things are making the connection. Now, just as I mentioned, these are non-linear. It is possible for someone to go from diffusion, foreclosure, moratorium, and achievement. It's also possible for when you're in achievement, you go back to moratorium or about something else. And the trajectory you place on these is different for all of those domains. So if we think about these different domains, it's possible that for career identity, you didn't spend a long time in diffusion. You went right to moratorium as a child, you explored lots of career options as a kid, and by the time you're an adolescent, you knew what you wanted to be. But then it's also possible that while you were doing that with your career, in terms of your cultural and ethnic identity, you picked foreclosure. Why not? It was ready-made, it made sense, it's who you are. But then you decided to go into moratorium about that when you were in university. And you decided that maybe there's parts of your culture you need to think about and you need to question. And then you go to achievement afterwards, but only to go back again later to moratorium. One of these domains, let's say hobbies, we might ping pong between achievement and moratorium multiple times over our life. What's important to understand is once we leave diffusion, we tend to not go back to diffusion. And once we go to moratorium for one of these domains, we tend to not go back to foreclosure. Now, it's possible to reach achievement through picking the same career path you would have picked in foreclosure. It's possible, let's say your family wanted you to grow up and take over the family business, and you were going to automatically do that, but then you allow yourself a period of questioning through moratorium. And after moratorium, you decide that's actually what you really want to do. By actually deciding that's what you really want to do, that's not foreclosure again, that's now achievement. Achievement is, it doesn't matter if you pick the original path or a new path, but it has to be something that you actually wanted after a period of questioning. Now, it's important to understand that we may still be constantly going back through moratorium even into our adulthood. That's totally normal. And so Marcia's theory would definitely work for both late adolescence as well as adulthood. But one of the things I want to point out that's different with self-identity in adulthood is how we evaluate our self-identity. In young adulthood, we tend to be very similar to adolescence. We tend to be very concerned about our appearance and our friendship. By the time we get to mid-adulthood, say about age 30 or so, depends on individual people, we tend to look at things slightly different. Instead of appearance being the most and highly weighted domain in our self-esteem, it tends now to be marriage and relationships. So relationships could be a relationship with your parents or your kids or your friends or what have you. But if you're married, if you have positive relationships in your life, this is what weighs most heavily for you in terms of how you feel about yourself. So this goes into Erik Erikson's next stage where he talks a lot about intimacy versus isolation. Do you have people in your life that care about you, whether they're romantic or what have you? Do you have people that you connect with that you can be vulnerable around? And so this becomes the most important thing for us to feel confident about ourselves and feel good about who we are. After that, we find that in adulthood, the next big thing is finances. Can you afford to pay your way? Are you living paycheck to paycheck? Are you struggling to get by? Or are you doing okay? And this isn't necessarily about how other people view you. It's more, how do you feel about your own financial situation? Third is your job status. Is your career going somewhere, or is it kind of stalled at the moment? Are you happy with your job? Is your job frustrating? Are you overworked? Do you feel like you can't have a good balance of work-life balance with your job? That's going to be another big part. Then there's the home status. Do you own your home? Do you have a safe roof over your head? Do you have a quiet place you can go to at the end of the day? A lot of time people are focused on the cosmetic quality of their home. Do they have their granite countertops and what have you? But it can also be more basic than that. Is the door broken? Is the window broken? Do they feel safe coming home at night? The next one that's really important for adults, but not so important for kids and adolescents, is the health and fitness status. So this is the idea, are you pre-diabetic? Are you at risk for heart disease? How is your back feeling? Are your knees crackling when you bend over? And then down below at the bottom of the list, this is when we have things like appearance and we have friendships. Of course, adults still care about their appearances, but it becomes much less salient. And friendships are something that, aside from immediate family and the close inner circle, become a lot harder to maintain in adulthood. So they become less of a key point. You've now reached the end of Unit 6, the Self, for Social Personality Development.